Good morning. Thank you for joining us for our song and story today. We hope that you're having a good day, and we hope you'll enjoy our video. Nathaniel, what song do we want to do this morning? All right. Are you going to show us how to do it with your hands? Let me start the music. Here it comes. Deep and wide, there's a fountain flowing deep and wide. Deep and wide, there's a fountain flowing deep and wide. Wide and deep, there's a fountain flowing wide and deep. Wide and deep, there's a fountain flowing wide and deep. We're so glad for that fountain. That fountain is from Jesus, and it washes us free from our sins. Yes, please sing with us. There's a fountain flowing deep and wide. Deep and wide, there's a fountain flowing deep and wide. Wide and deep, there's a fountain flowing wide and deep. Wide and deep, there's a fountain flowing wide and deep.
I was directing.
You were directing?
Yeah.
Our story today is another in the James Herriot collection called Blossom Comes Home, illustrated by Ruth Brown. I arrived at Mr. Dacken's farm just outside Derby on a warm April morning. The green hillside ran down to the river, and the spring sunshine danced on the water. The birds were singing, and the lambs played on the flower-strewn pastures. Good morning, Cricket. I saw Mr. Dacken in the cow barn and went across to him. The farmer had a long face, made even longer by his drooping mustache. He was a kind man, but always looked mournful, and this morning he looked even sadder than ever. I had come to examine a litter of piglets who had upset tummies, but Mr. Dacken seemed in no hurry to leave the barn. He was gazing at his old short-horned cow, Blossom. "She's got to go, Mr. Herriot." "Oh, Blossom? Why?" I asked. "It's not paying me to keep her any more. She's not giving enough milk now, and I have to sell plenty of milk to keep my farm going. Jack Dodson is coming this morning to take her to market." He rested his hand briefly on the old cow's back. "I'm right sorry to see her go. She's like an old friend. She's stood in that stall for 12 years and given me thousands of gallons of milk. She doesn't owe me anything." There were only 6 cows in the cobbled barn with its low roof and wooden partitions, and they all had names. You don't find cows with names anymore, and there aren't many farmers like Mr. Dacken who somehow scratch a living from a herd of 6 milking cows and a few calves, pigs, and hens. As if she knew she were the topic of conversation, Blossom turned her head and looked at him. She was very ancient. Her pelvic bones jutted out from her skinny body, and her udder drooped almost to the ground. But there was something appealing in the friendliness of the eyes and the patient expression on her face. Mr. Dacken had fallen silent as he looked fondly at his cow. I was about to suggest that we might see the piglets when I heard a clattering of boots on the yard, and Jack Dodson, the cattle drover, hurried to the barn. "Now then, Mr. Dacken," he cried, "it's easy to see which one you want me to take. It's that old skinny thing over there." He pointed to Blossom, and in truth, the unkind description seemed to fit the bony creature, standing among her sleek neighbors. The farmer didn't reply for a moment. Then he went between the cows and gently rubbed Blossom's forehead. "Aye, this is the one, Jack." Then he undid the chain round about her neck. "Off you go, lass," he murmured, and the cow turned and made her way placidly from the stall. Come along," shouted Jack Dodson, prodding the cow's rump. "Don't hit her," barked Mr. Dacken. Mr. Dodson looked at him in surprise. "I never hit him, you know that. I just keep him moving along like." "All right," Mr. Dacken replied, "but you won't need your stick for this one. She'll go wherever you want. Always has done." Hi, Cricket. Blossom proved him right and ambled across the yard. She turned up the track to join a group of fat bullocks and cows standing on the road high above. A dog and a boy circled them, keeping them together. The farmer and I stood watching as Blossom made her way on hurriedly up the hill, Jack Dodson following behind her. As the path wound behind an old gray barn, man and beast disappeared. Mr. Dacken still gazed after them, listening to the clip-clop of the hooves on the hard ground. When the sound had died away, he turned to me quickly. "Right, Mr. Herriot. We'll get on with seeing those little pigs." There were 12 squealing piglets in the sty with their mother. The farmer, Cricket, gently picked each one up and held it while I gave it an injection which could make it better. This took me about 15 minutes, and I tried to pass the time by talking about the weather, cricket matches, and other things, but Mr. Dakin replied only with a series of grunts. I could see that he was still thinking about Blossom. "Cricket, you're making it hard to read again." I, too, was thinking about the old cow as I drove away from the farm, up the track, and onto the road above. On my way home, I had to pass through the nearby village of Briston, and as I arrived, I saw the herd of cattle at the far end of the street. Mr. Dodson was making another collection, and the boy was chatting to some friends by the roadside. I could see Blossom at the rear of the group, with her head turned, looking back. Briston was where Mrs. Pickering lived with her 3 basset hounds and Buster, the cat who was once her Christmas Day kitten. One of the dogs had broken his leg a month before, and I had to remove the plaster cast this morning. I lifted the dog onto the table, and while I was cutting away the plaster, Buster kept frisking around, pawing playfully at my hand as the solemn-faced Bassets looked on disapprovingly. After I had taken off the plaster, I could see that the leg had set very well. "He'll be fine now, Mrs. Pickering," I said. Just then I saw a single unattended cow trot past the window. This was unusual, because cows always have somebody in charge of them. And anyway, there was something familiar about this one. I hurried to the window and looked out. It was Blossom. "Please excuse me, Mrs. Pickering," I said. I packed my bag and rushed out to my car. Blossom was moving down the village street at a good pace, her eyes fixed steadily ahead as though she were going somewhere important. What on earth had happened? People in the street were staring at her, and a postman nearly fell off his bike as she pushed past them. Then she disappeared round the corner and out of sight. I had to turn the car, and then drove after her at top speed. But when I rounded the corner, there was no sign of her, and the road that stretched ahead of me was empty. She had vanished, but where had she gone? One thing was certain. I had to go back to Mr. Dakin's farm and tell him that Blossom had broken away and was loose in the countryside. I urged my little car as fast as I could, and when I reached the farm, I met Mr. Dakin carrying a sack of grain across the yard. He looked at me in surprise. "Hello, Mr. Harriet. Have you forgotten something?" I was about to blurt out my story when he raised his head suddenly and listened. "What's that?" he said. From somewhere on the hillside above us, I could hear the clip-clop of hooves. As we stood in the yard and listened, a cow rounded a rocky outcrop and came towards us. It was Blossom, moving at a brisk trot, great udders swinging, eyes fixed purposely on the barn door. "What on earth?" burst out Mr. Dakin, but the old cow brushed past us and marched without hesitation into the stall she'd occupied for the past 12 years. She sniffed inquiringly at the empty hayrack and looked round at her astonished owner. Mr. Dakin stared back at her. The eyes in the weathered face were watery, and he began to pull thoughtfully at his long mustache. The silence was broken by the sound of heavy boots on the cobbles of the yard, and Jack Dodson panted his way through the door. "Oh, there you are, you old scallywag," he gasped. "I'm right sorry, Mr. Dakin. I left that lad in charge for a few minutes, and he let her escape." Then he moved towards Blossom. "Come on, lass, let's be having you out of here." But he halted as Mr. Dakin held an arm in front of him. There was a long silence as Dodson looked in surprise at the farmer, who continued to gaze at the cow. There was a quiet dignity about the old animal as she stood there against the crumbling timbers of the partition, her eyes patient and undemanding. Then, still without speaking, Mr. Dakin moved on hurriedly between the cows, and the faint click of metal sounded as he fastened the chain around Blossom's neck. Next he strolled to the end of the barn and returned with a forkful of hay, which he tossed expertly into the wooden rack. This was what Blossom was waiting for. She snitched a mouthful and began to chew with quiet satisfaction. "What's going on?" cried Jack Dodson in bewilderment. "I'll be late for market." "I'm sorry I've wasted your time, Jack," the farmer replied slowly. "But you'll have to go without her." "Without her? But," sputtered Mr. Dodson. "Ah, you think I'm daft. But that's how it is. The old lass has come home, and she's staying home." Mr. Dodson shook his head and left to get back to market. "Mr. Harriet," he said, "do you ever feel that sometimes when something unexpected happened, they were meant to, and that it works out for the best in the end?" "Yes," I said, "I often think that." "Well, that's how I felt when Blossom came back down the hill." He reached out and scratched the old cow's back. "She's always been my favorite, and I'm glad she's back." I was still puzzled. "But I can't understand how she got here. Why didn't I see her on the road? Where did she disappear to?" A smile spread slowly across Mr. Dakin's face, and he pulled again at his long mustache. "Oh, there's another way to the farm, a little path which starts near the village." "And Blossom knows that path?" "Oh, aye. The old girl knows about everything about this place. I looked at the 6 cows in a row. Didn't you say that you couldn't afford to keep her? I asked, worried. That's right, but I have an idea, the farmer replied. I can put 2 or 3 calves on to her instead of milking her. The old stable across the yard is empty, and she can live in there quite happily. What a wonderful idea, Mr. Dakin. She'll be very comfortable there, and she'll suckle 3 calves easily. She would probably pay her way. Well, I'm not worried about that, said the farmer, smiling. After all these years, she doesn't owe me anything. The important thing is that Blossom has come home. Did you enjoy our book, Cricket? Was it a fun book? Yeah.
No.
Blossom comes home. Thank you so much for watching. We have a little song for you. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. Come back again, we'll see you soon. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye.